welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by the author of an absolutely gorgeous book that really captivated me for the past few days. It's just really dreamy and lovely and really relentlessly readable. So I'm very excited to talk about it. Welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hello, it's lovely to be here. So I'm Lucy Ashe, and I am the author of The Sleeping Beauties. The Sleeping Beauties is a historical mystery set at the end of the Second World War. It starts with two strangers who meet on a train. One of them is returning evacuees to London at the end of the Second World War, and one of them is returning to dance at the Sadler's Wells, or in Sadler's Wells Ballet Company. The backdrop for the novel is the work of the Sadler's Wells Ballet Company during the Second World War and the tremendous efforts of that company to bring the performing arts to so many countries during a time of conflict. And the novel is also a dark and gothic retelling of the fairy tale of the Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah, it has so much going on and it is all interwoven so beautifully. Before we get into the book itself, I was wondering if you could just start off by telling us a little bit about your career and your journey toward this book. I understand that this is your second novel, and I know that you have some dance experience yourself. So could you talk about how you arrived here?
Yeah, so I used to dance a lot. I trained at the Royal Ballet School. I started there when I was 7 as a junior associate, and then I went to the Royal Ballet boarding school from the age of 11, which was a very intense experience. I was definitely at the Royal Ballet School in order to train to be a professional dancer. You know, you're dancing every day for many hours, but it didn't quite work out the way I suppose I dreamt of. I didn't end up going into the Royal Ballet Company or a ballet company. I ended up changing career plans and going to Oxford University and doing an English degree. I had some issues with my body. I was getting a bit injured, so I had to make this change. And I became an English teacher after that, which I absolutely loved. But I couldn't really leave ballet behind. It kept coming back to me in different ways. I really wanted to find a way to bring ballet back into my life. So I decided to write a novel based in the ballet world. And it was wonderful to return to dance that way because I remember from my time at the Royal Ballet School really enjoying the lessons that we had on the history of ballet and the sort of different productions throughout the 20th century. So I decided to start researching the early years of the Royal Ballet Company, which was called the Vic Wells Ballet in 1931. And this led to my first novel, The Dance of the Dolls, which is set in 1933, and it's about two identical twin ballerinas who are rehearsing for the ballet Coppelia at the Sadler's Wells Ballet Theatre, and it's a historical thriller. There are two men, a point shoemaker and a piano player who become obsessed with the girls, and that leads to everything to start to unravel. So I finished writing The Dance of the Dolls, and that was wonderful. And I was very lucky to get a 2-book deal. So I decided to write a second ballet historical novel. And this one, I wanted to write about another really formative time for British ballet, which was during the Second World War. It was during this time that the ballet company, the Sadler's Wells Ballet Company, which is now the Royal Ballet, traveled all across the UK, they traveled to Europe. They had this amazing time during the war of not stopping at all and actually producing new works and bringing a love of ballet to so many people who wouldn't really have thought of going to the ballet or being interested in ballet before. So I decided that that's where I wanted to set my novel, and the research for it began.
I'm very curious about what that research process was like because I was not aware of this effort. And I thought that it was such a fascinating, rich bit of history for the setting of a novel like this. What did you look at when you were researching the Sadler's Wells Theater? Because I had no idea of that fascinating history and how long it goes back and how many different incarnations that it's had in that long life. So yeah, could you talk about what it was like to uncover that, institution's history?
Yeah, so for me it was always a part of, I suppose, my own experience of being at the Royal Ballet School. We learned about the history of the school. We learned that the founder, Dame Nanette de Valois, set up her School of Choreographic Art in 1926, and then she can built on that to renovate the Sadler's Wells Theatre, which is in Islington in London, with another lady called Lillian Bayliss. And the theatre was in ruins in the late 1920s, and they managed to bring a lot of people together to raise some money to open this theatre. And the theatre, when it began, it was really small. Well, the Vic Wells Ballet was really small. There weren't that many dancers. There were a few sort of star dancers that she'd managed to steal from some other companies. The famous ballet company at that time was the Ballet Russe. So the Ballet Russe was this kind of touring company that had its origins in Russia, but actually they didn't perform in Russia. Most of them had fled Russia at the end of, well, during the Russian Revolution, like 1917. So the British population thought of ballet as the Ballet Russe, of Russian ballet, of European star ballerinas, and they didn't really think that there was a British ballet at all. In fact, if they did, it was more these little kind of tiny dances in variety shows. It wasn't really seen as a respected art form. It was just sort of a little bit of fun, really. And so it was the work of Dame Nanette de Valois in the 1930s that really gave British ballet a kind of reputation of its own, and they created all these wonderful new works. She found these choreographers like Frederick Ashton, and it really went from there. So I suppose I knew a lot about that world of dancing, and I started researching mostly by reading a lot of memoirs. So Dame Nanette de Valois, Margot Fontaine, the other people who worked to set up this company. So Constant Lambert was the music director. I just did a lot of reading and also exploring some of the archives at the Royal Ballet School. I was really lucky that I was given the opportunity to go back to the archives there, which is, where I was a student. In fact, the manager of the special collections there, the archivist, she had taught me when I was at the school, and she was very welcoming and bringing me back to look through all of that. The research for the Sleeping Beauties was a little bit easier than for my first book because more had been written about the work of the ballet company during the Second World War. So I had a great time being able to read some memoirs from dancers at the time, some diary entries, and it was very immersive, certainly.
Hmm. Yeah, it sounds like a really fascinating process. And there was even a lot, I think, for, an American whose history of World War II is very different to really, come to understand vividly what the post-war experience was like too, and during the war. That leads me to my questions about Rosamund. I would love to talk about her and sort of like how you crafted her and just the whole phenomenon of children being sent away from the city in order to live in the country where it was safer during the war. I know that that's sort of like is the catalyst for like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It starts a lot of children's stories. But yeah, could you talk about crafting Rosamund, putting her in this context and sort of where the beginning of the story finds her?
Yeah, so Rosamund Carridon is mother of Jasmine, and during the war, she opens up her home in the British countryside, in English countryside in Devon, to look after lots of evacuees. So during the Second World War, children living in cities were given the option to leave. In fact, they were strongly encouraged to leave. Lots of schools basically worked together, and the entire school would get on the train and go out to the countryside, and then they would be distributed between different people's houses. It didn't quite work out the way that I think the government had planned, in the sense that lots of children got to the countryside and then immediately their parents wanted to bring them back again, especially because the war started in September 1939, and actually for quite a while there really wasn't anything happening in Britain in terms of sort of any bombing, any sort of danger to the life of people in the cities there. It was actually called the phony war those first few months. And so lots of parents actually brought their children back home because it's very difficult to send a young child away. They were going away at a very, very young age. And what I write about in The Sleeping Beauties is Rosamund having looked after all these children, and at the start of the novel, she's returning them to London, the last few evacuees to London, the ones who have kind of stayed the course and been there for most of the war with her. And there are these two twin boys who she's returning. And they arrived with her when they were, I think, 5 years old, and they're now 10. And their mother has not seen them for that time. And I remember researching a lot of stories about what it must have been like to, to send your children away, and just imagining not seeing your child for that formative time of their life and how different they would look when you saw them again. But for Rosamond, she really felt a strong sense of purpose during the war. She loved looking after all these children. It really was very wonderful for her. So she's very sad when she takes them back to London, and gives them up. And this is one of the key parts of her character, is that she then becomes even more protective over her own daughter, Jasmine. And then this ballerina, Briarwoods, walks into the train and immediately gives Jasmine all this attention. And Jasmine is like, oh, it's a ballet dancer, it's a beautiful woman, and becomes very fixated with her. And Rosamond does not like this at all.
Mm. It is an absolutely fascinating dynamic between Rosamond and Briar. It really was a constant source of tension and just like the impulse to keep reading. It was, so, as I said before, impulsively readable. Could you talk a little bit about, crafting that dynamic? And this is a question I often have for romance writers, but I think it applies here too, is that when you have characters who have an intense relationship that's not always 100% positive, but complex. How do you balance the forces that are pushing them together and those that are, driving them apart? Like, how do you manage that conflict so that it stays at like the simmering point, if that kind of makes sense?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's a difficult thing to do, and I'm really glad that it came across that way. Thank you. Um, I think there has to be an emotion to the way that you write. I'm a very emotional writer. I find it quite emotionally exhausting because I think I am putting myself in the characters' worlds, and I am imagining what it must be like to have kind of an obsession. I think writers can be quite obsessional people anyway, so we can channel all of those things. I think my past also was a dancer. I have certain obsessional qualities that I can funnel into my writing. So I think when you have a relationship that is unhealthy in many ways, and I think Briar in particularly has got unhealthy relationships, and her obsession with Jasmine, Rosamond's daughter, is unhealthy as well. You have to, well, I have to understand where does that obsession come from, and to really try and get inside it, because it's been fascinating reading reviews of this book. I try not to read too many, but because some people really hate Briar. They think she's really unlikable. She's so flawed. They think what she does is completely unforgivable. And that's, obviously fair enough. But for me, I suppose I had much more sympathy for her because I was understanding where those behaviors were coming from. You find out throughout the book her backstory, really, what has led her to behave this way. And a lot of it has been things that have happened to her that have affected the way that she sees herself and her role in the world. So I think rather than thinking, oh, is the dynamic right at this moment? Am I keeping the tension at the right place? It's about trying to get deep into the motivations beneath the character. Maybe I'm kind of psychoanalyzing my characters a little bit to really be able to understand what happens when they meet someone and how they behave with that person.
That's really interesting. I found her sympathetic, despite some of her choices, let's say. um, but I really thought she was so effectively written because for me, it was so clear that like when she shows up and she's, interacting with Rosamond and her daughter, it was so clear that her way of acting, this sort of like very sweet, high energy performativeness would set off a lot of red flags for a grown up and be so charming to a child. Like, so that like, I don't think she has to be charming to grown-ups because she has won like the heart of this child. And that's a source of tension on its own. I just found it so fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was interesting to think about the way in which, in that train carriage at the start, Rosamond and Jasmine are having completely different perspectives on the same person. I mean, my first novel, The Dance of the Dolls, was written between 4 different narrative points of view. Each chapter alternated. And that was quite fun because I could think about how the same event would be perceived very differently by the different characters. But to do it within the same moment, I thought was quite fun as well.
Yeah, it was really fun. I actually love how this book handles dual perspectives and dual timelines. Like there's a lot of really complex stuff happening with the structure here. And I'm curious about how that came out in the writing. When it came to either the different points of perspective, let's say, or the timeline jumps, did you write them separately and then integrate them, or did you write them all in communication with each other? Like how different is your first draft from what we are, reading on the page now?
Yeah, this novel was really hard to structure because, as you say, it's got two timelines, but it's also got two perspectives. And I wanted, I guess, to keep us in one moment in terms of the narrative tension, and that is 1940, well, end of 1945 to the February 1946 performance of The Sleeping Beauty, where all kind of the main climactic events take place towards the end of the novel. But so I wanted to keep us sort of inside that moment because that is really where you're not sure what's going to happen and that. But also the past stories were really important as well in order to be able to understand why the current events were so important. So my first plan was just a complete chronological plan, chapter by chapter, going from really some of the backstories actually take place in 1919 and then go all the way to 1946. But I remember having a conversation with my agent, and he was like, "This is reading kind of like a 20th century epic. And it's not really reading like a historical mystery in terms of the structure." And I don't think I'd maybe written the first sort of 20,000 words at this point. And so I went away and I completely restructured all my plan and then started writing it again. And it worked much better when I jumbled things up a bit and tried to keep us in the 1946 time period, but with flashbacks back to the past.
Mhm. I do love that structure because I love I think it's really interesting because when you switch timelines, you can do that to reveal something new, or you can do it to kind of hide something and create like a little bit of, a mystery, some tension, waiting for to see what's going to happen next. And I really love how that timeline manipulation affects the pacing of the novel. Talking about, I don't want to say anything specific about the end because there are lots of juicy twists. And so I will let you reveal as much as you are comfortable revealing. But I'm curious also about the end and if that was fully realized at the beginning or if that developed as you wrote. Because it's very complicated, I think, to structure a book that you can get to the kind of ending that you did. And I'm really curious about what your drafting was like there and all that.
The ending was really difficult because there's so much that is revealed in the final sort of 3, 4 chapters. And I wanted to make sure that even though these are big twists, that are surprising, exciting, hopefully for the reader, I personally don't enjoy it when I'm reading a book and I find there's a twist that I couldn't possibly have guessed for myself. I think that's really unfair. To be honest, I think Agatha Christie sometimes did that, and I would read the book and I was like, but how was I possibly supposed to know that? I do want to be able to look back and think, oh, actually, yeah, that makes sense. I could work that out. So it's sort of like dropping in breadcrumbs along the way that when you think back, you're like, yes, I can see this. But really for the ending, it was also about the narrative tension, and I'm revealing a lot of stories from the past, but I also want to keep us in the present moment. So I rewrote the final 4 or 5 chapters so many times to try and think about how are the characters telling each other the stories. So we have Alice Woods, who is Briar Woods, the ballet dancer's mother, telling us a story. And I didn't just want it to kind of disappear from where they are and go back into this past. I wanted us to be experiencing how the other characters were reacting to her telling this story as well. So that took quite a lot of work and editing as well. But then there's the very end of the novel, there was a section that I wrote, I suppose, I didn't have it in my first or second, maybe even third draft. And I felt like I needed a bit of distance from the tension of the ending, and to have a sort of moment of, okay, what is going to happen next for these characters? Are relationships going to be healed? Are they going to be resolved? And I didn't think that I necessarily needed to answer all of those questions, but I needed to at least provide a space for there to be the possibility of those questions being answered. So I think I was able to do that with the way I decided to end the novel, because I also find it difficult and frustrating when a novel ends and I really don't know what's going to happen next with some of these characters. And obviously that's fine to have loose ends, and there are definitely loose ends at the end of mine. But I do think that the reader is able to imagine something for these characters at the end.
It's sort of a sleight of hand that you have to perform, right? Because you have to lay all that work throughout the beginning of the novel, but it has to be invisible too, because you can't telegraph it too hard. And that's such a fine line to walk. And I think you do it so well with this book. It was immensely enjoyable to read. So thank you for coming to talk about it.
Well, thank you. It's great to talk about it.
What is next for you? Are you working on something new?
Yeah, so I've loved writing to ballet novels. The Dance of the Dolls and the Sleeping Beauties were I guess, my return to dance in a way that was just so fulfilling. And it's actually brought me back to dance in some ways. Like I've been going to more ballet classes, I've been going to the theatre more. It's been so exciting. But I decided about a year ago that I would write something different for my next book. So my next one is not ballet related, which has required a different sort of research and taken me down paths that I didn't think I would go down. It's set in the 1960s, and it's about an ex-fashion model who develops an obsession with her psychotherapist. And that required some really interesting exploration into the world of psychotherapy and Freud and Jung and the way that therapy developed during the middle of the 20th century. So exciting to have something different to be working towards now.
That does sound very interesting. Well, I hope you don't mind if I am in touch, when that project's developing, and maybe you can come back and talk about that one because that sounds great.
Yeah, I'd love to, definitely.
All right. Well, listeners, it's now your turn. Please check out The Sleeping Beauties. It's available now. It'll be available when you hear this. So please head to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for your books. It is now time to close this chapter. Bye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.